In the year 1519, as Hernan courts marched toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the Emperor Moctezuma II sent messengers to greet the Spanish conquistador with gifts of extraordinary valued turquoise masks, golden discs, feathered cloaks of iridescent green. But among these treasures was something the Spanish could not understand: fragments of ancient jade and pottery, relics gathered from the ruins of a city that had fallen 3 centuries before the Aztecs ever rose to power. To Moctezuma, these broken pieces from the lost city of Tollan held more sacred value than all the gold in his empire. They were proof of legitimacy, fragments of a golden age when philosopher-kings ruled with wisdom, when artists created works of impossible beauty, when civilization itself reached its apex before tumbling into darkness. The Aztecs, for all their power and glory, saw themselves as mere shadows of the Toltecs who came before. This is the story of that vanished civilization, of the tension between myth and history, between the philosopher and the warrior, between the world as it was and the world as we remember it. This is the story of Tollan, the city of legend, and of the question that haunts every civilization: can wisdom ever truly rule, or must power always triumph in the end? The name Tollan appears throughout Mesoamerican mythology like a recurring dream, always just beyond reach, always impossibly perfect. To the Aztecs, who dominated central Mexico in the 15th and early 16th centuries, Tollan represented everything they aspired to be. In their histories, the Toltecs were master craftsmen whose featherwork could make birds seem to fly, whose goldwork captured the very essence of the sun, whose astronomers could predict the movements of Venus with uncanny precision. The Toltecs knew how to make cotton grow in colors, eliminating the need for dyes. They grew squash so large a man could not reach around them. Their corn was so abundant that the smaller ears were used as fuel for fires. This was Tollan, as the Aztecs remembered it, a paradise of abundance and artistry, a place where human potential reached its fullest expression. But there is something deeply human in this mythology, something that transcends the specific details of Mesoamerican culture. Every civilization creates its golden age, its lost paradise, its time when things were better, purer, more noble than the compromised present. The Greeks had their age of heroes, when demigods walked the earth and performed impossible feats. The Romans looked back to the virtuous simplicity of the early republic before wealth and empire corrupted their character. Medieval Europeans constructed elaborate fantasies about King Arthur and Camelot, a realm of chivalry and honor that probably never existed in the crude reality of post-Roman Britain. The Chinese continuously returned to the sage kings of antiquity, rulers who governed through moral example rather than force. In each case, the Golden Age serves a psychological and political function. It provides a standard against which the present can be measured and found wanting. It offers hope that human beings are capable of something better than what we see around us. And crucially, it provides legitimacy to those who can claim connection to that vanished perfection. The Aztecs needed Tollan for all these reasons. They were, in many ways, uncomfortable with their own success. They had arrived in the Valley of Mexico as despised barbarians, Chichimic nomads from the north, whom the established city-states regarded with contempt. Through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer ruthlessness, they had risen to dominate an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean, from the deserts of the north to the jungles of the south. But military conquest alone does not confer cultural legitimacy. The Aztecs were acutely aware that the peoples they subjugated viewed them as upstarts, as crude warriors, without the refinement of truly civilized nations. So they constructed an elaborate genealogy connecting their ruling dynasty to the Toltec kings of Tollan. They made pilgrimages to the ruins of Tula to gather sacred relics. They claimed that their gods, their calendar, their arts, their very way of life descended from Toltec wisdom. In doing so, they transformed military conquest into cultural inheritance, force into legitimacy. This pattern repeats throughout human history with remarkable consistency. The Macedonians claimed descent from Greek heroes to justify their conquest of Greece. The Romans insisted they were descendants of Trojan refugees, linking themselves to the epic tradition of Homer. The Holy Roman emperors positioned themselves as heirs to the Caesars, despite the centuries and cultural chasms that separated them. The Russian czars called Moscow the Third Rome, inheriting the mantle of Constantinople and Rome itself. In each case, raw power seeks validation through connection to a more prestigious past. The conqueror wants to be seen not as a destroyer, but as a restorer, not as an innovator, but as a conservator of ancient wisdom. This is not mere cynicism or propaganda, though it certainly serves those purposes. It reflects something deeper about how human beings understand authority and legitimacy. We want our leaders to embody continuity with tradition, to represent something larger and older than themselves. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, where it transcends the familiar pattern of invented traditions and mythologized pasts. The Toltecs were real. Beneath the layers of myth and idealization, there was an actual civilization that rose and fell in central Mexico between roughly 900 and 1200 CE. The city of Tula exists. You can visit it today, about 50 miles north of Mexico City, and walk among the ruins that so impressed the Aztec pilgrims. The massive Atlantid warrior statues still stand atop the pyramid of Tlahuacalpantu, their stone eyes gazing across the valley. The archaeological evidence confirms that this was indeed a major urban center, a capital that dominated the region for 2.5 centuries. The Toltecs did produce remarkable art, did establish far-flung trade networks, did influence cultures from central Mexico to the Maya regions of the Yucatan Peninsula. So we are not dealing with pure fantasy, not with an Atlantis conjured entirely from imagination. We are dealing with something more complex and more revealing, a real civilization that became mythologized by its successors, historical fact transformed into cultural archetype. This transformation raises profound questions about the nature of historical memory. How does a real city become a mythical paradise? What gets remembered and what gets forgotten in this process? What does the gap between archaeological reality and cultural memory tell us about the needs and anxieties of the remembering culture? The archaeological Tula was a city of perhaps 30 to 60,000 people at its height, impressive by the standards of its time, but not extraordinarily large. It was heavily militarized, its art dominated by images of warriors and human sacrifice. The city shows evidence of internal violence and was ultimately burned and abandoned, possibly by its own inhabitants. This is a far cry from the paradise of peace and artistry described in Aztec sources. Yet both versions are true in their own way. The archaeological record tells us what happened. The mythology tells us what it meant to the people who came after, what they needed it to mean. To understand the Toltecs, then, we must operate on two levels simultaneously. we must examine the material evidence, the stones and bones, the shards of pottery and obsidian blades, the architectural remains and burial goods that archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered over the past century. But we must also take seriously the mythology, not as simple error or fabrication, but as a different kind of truth. The stories the Aztecs told about Tollan reveal what they valued, what they feared, what they believed civilization should aspire to. And at the heart of these stories stands a figure who embodies the central tension of political philosophy, the eternal question that Plato posed in the Republic. Should societies be ruled by philosophers, or by warriors, by wisdom, or by force? The Aztecs called him Quetzalcoatl, Tapleton Quetzalcoatl, read our prince, the feathered serpent. And his story, half history and half myth, illuminates truths about power and governance that remain relevant 25 centuries after Plato first articulated them. But before we can understand Tapleton Quetzalcoatl and the civilization he allegedly founded, we must first understand the world he emerged from, the crisis that made Tollan possible. And that story begins with the greatest catastrophe in Mesoamerican history, the fall of Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. Around the year 550 of the Common Era, something terrible happened at Teotihuacan. The city had dominated central Mexico for nearly 7 centuries, a vast metropolis of perhaps 125,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Its monumental architecture, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, proclaimed the power and sophistication of its rulers. Its influence extended across Mesoamerica, its distinctive artistic styles and architectural forms appearing in sites from the Gulf Coast to the Maya heartland. Teotihuacan was not merely a city, but a world system, a cultural and economic superpower whose collapse would reshape the entire region. The archaeological evidence for this collapse is stark and disturbing. Excavations in the city center reveal extensive burning, not the accidental destruction of war, but the systematic torching of temples and palaces. The Great Pyramids were not damaged, but the administrative buildings, the residences of the elite, the temples where the gods were worshipped, these were deliberately set aflame. Statues were smashed, monuments defaced, elaborate murals destroyed. This was not conquest by an external enemy seeking to claim the city's wealth. This was something darker and more intimate, the city turning on itself, the people rising against their rulers in an orgy of destruction. Whether this was revolution, religious upheaval, or the final collapse of a system that could no longer feed its population, we cannot say with certainty, but the results were unmistakable. By 600 CE, the great city was largely abandoned, its temples silent, its marketplaces empty, its sophisticated water management systems falling into disrepair. The fall of Teotihuacan created what historians sometimes call the Epic Classic period, a time of fragmentation and reorganization that lasted roughly from 600 to 900 CE. The collapse of a hegemonic power created both crisis and opportunity. Without Teotihuacan's stabilizing influence, the region fractured into competing city-states, each claiming a piece of the former empire's prestige and territory. But this was not simply chaos. It was a period of intense creativity and experimentation, as different communities tried different solutions to the problem of political organization. How do you create stability without the overwhelming dominance of a single center? How do you maintain trade networks without a hegemon to enforce the rules? How do you legitimize authority when the old order has been consumed by flames? The archaeological record from this period shows a striking pattern. Settlements moved from the valley floors to defensible hilltops. Cities like Quetzalcoatl, and Quintana emerged as regional powers, each protected by massive fortifications that would have been unnecessary in Teotihuacan's shadow. This shift from valleys to hilltops tells us something important about the changed nature of political power. Teotihuacan had ruled through a combination of religious authority, economic integration, and probably a good measure of fear, but it had not needed massive walls. The epiclassic cities clearly did. This suggests a world where warfare was more common, where each city-state had to be prepared to defend itself against its neighbors, where the threat of violence was a constant presence in political calculation. But warfare in Mesoamerica was never simply about territory or resources, though these certainly mattered. It was also about captives. The epic classic period saw a dramatic increase in the iconography of human sacrifice, particularly in the depiction of captured warriors being killed to feed the gods. This is visible in the elaborate murals at Quetzalcoatl, which show Mayan and Central Mexican warriors in brutal combat, the defeated being led to sacrifice. It appears in the skull racks depicted at Quetzalcoatl, where rows of severed heads proclaim the power of the victorious city. The intensification of sacrificial imagery during this period is not coincidental. When the legitimacy provided by ancient tradition and unchallenged dominance disappears, rulers must find new ways to prove their right to rule. Success in warfare and the ability to provide the gods with sacrificial victims became increasingly important markers of legitimate authority. This shift has parallels in other historical contexts. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, Europe fragmented into competing kingdoms ruled by warrior elites. Legitimacy came from military success, from the ability to reward followers with plunder and land, from demonstrating martial prowess. The elaborate Roman system of civil administration, with its educated bureaucrats and complex legal codes, gave way to a simpler, more direct form of rule, the warrior king and his band of armed followers. Similarly, when the Bronze Age palace economies of the Mediterranean collapsed around 1200 BC, the centuries that followed were dominated by warrior aristocracies. The bureaucratic complexity of Mycenaean Greece or Hittite Anatolia was replaced by the world. Homer described in the Iliad a world where status came from excellence in battle, where kings were first and foremost, military leaders, where heroism in combat was the highest virtue. The epic classic period in Mesoamerica followed a similar trajectory. The collapse of Teotihuacan's complex theocratic state created space for a more militarized form of authority. But this created a problem, one that would shape the entire Toltec period. How do you build a stable, prosperous civilization on a foundation of constant warfare? How do you create the conditions for art, architecture, trade, and all the other elements of urban life when your society's values and institutions are organized around military competition? This tension between the destructive demands of warfare and the constructive requirements of civilization would define the Toltec experiment. And it would find its symbolic expression in the mythological conflict between two gods, or perhaps two men who became gods, or gods who took human form. The details blur in the sources, but the meaning remains clear. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wind and wisdom, patron of priests and artists, represented one vision of what civilization should be. Tezcatlipoca, the smoke and mirror, god of warriors and sorcerers, master of fate and conflict, represented another. Their struggle would shape the destiny of Tollan. But before that struggle could unfold, before the philosopher-king could challenge the established order, Tollan itself had to be founded. And that story begins, as so many stories of civilization begin, with migration. The Aztec sources tell us that the Toltecs emerged from the fusion of two peoples, the settled, civilized inhabitants of central Mexico and the incoming Chichimecs from the north. The word Chichimec is complex and loaded with meaning. Literally, it means something like dog lineage or people of dog ancestry, not exactly flattering. The civilized city-states of central Mexico used it to describe the nomadic and semi-nomadic groups who inhabited the arid regions to the north, people they regarded as barbarians, uncultured, uncivilized, living without proper cities or agriculture. But like many terms of disparagement, it could also be claimed with pride. The Chichimecs were fierce warriors, uncorrupted by the softness and luxury of urban life, possessing a vigor and martial excellence that effete city dwellers had lost. This dichotomous civilized versus barbarian, cultured versus martial, sophisticated but decadent versus crude but vitilupiers in culture after culture. The Romans defined themselves against the Germanic tribes beyond their borders, seeing them as savage, but also possessing a freedom and courage that Romans themselves had lost. The Chinese literally built walls to keep out the northern barbarians, the Xiongnu and later the Mongols, yet repeatedly found their dynasties conquered or revitalized by these same outsiders. The cycle became almost predictable. Settled civilization grows wealthy and sophisticated, but also complacent and militarily weak, nomadic. Warriors from the margins conquer them, the conquerors adopt the civilization of the conquered, become sophisticated themselves, grow weak, and are conquered, in turn, by the next wave of barbarians. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian of the 14th century, formulated this pattern into a comprehensive theory of civilization. He argued that nomadic peoples possess asabiya, social cohesion, or group solidarity, forged by the harsh conditions of desert life and the constant need for mutual support. This solidarity makes them formidable warriors. When they conquer settled civilizations, they initially rule effectively, their cohesion and vigor overcoming the fractious squabbling of urban elites. But luxury and comfort gradually erode their asabiya. Within a few generations, the conquering dynasty has become indistinguishable from the urban elite they conquered, and they in turn become vulnerable to the next group of nomads with strong asabiya. Whether or not we accept Ibn Khaldun's specific mechanism, the historical pattern he identified is undeniable. The fusion of nomadic military power with settled civilizations' administrative and cultural sophistication has repeatedly produced dynamic new societies. The early Islamic caliphates emerged from this kind of fusion. Arab tribal warriors conquering the sophisticated urban civilizations of Persia and the Byzantine East, then creating a hybrid culture that synthesized Arab, Persian, Greek, and other elements into something new and extraordinary. The Mongol conquests ultimately led to the Yuan dynasty in China, where nomadic conquerors adopted Chinese administrative practices while maintaining some elements of their martial tradition. The Mughals in India, the Ottomans in Anatolia, the Manchus in China followed variations of this pattern. The Toltec origin story fits this template. According to the Annals de Quetzalcoatl and other sources, a leader named Mixcoatl Serpent led his Chichimec followers south from a place called Chicamostoc, the Seven Caves, This may be a real geographical location, or it may be a mythological site of origin, or, most likely, both. The 7 caves appear in multiple Mesoamerican migration narratives, including the Aztec origin story, suggesting they functioned as a kind of archetypal homeland. Mixcoatl and his followers conquered several cities in central Mexico, establishing dominance through military superiority. But Mixcoatl understood that military conquest alone was insufficient for building a lasting civilization. So he married a woman named Chimelman, described in some sources as a local princess, in others as a manifestation of the earth goddess. Through this marriage, he united the martial prowess of the Chichimecs with the cultural legitimacy and agricultural knowledge of the settled peoples. From this union was born Quetzalcoatl, Tapleton, the future Quetzalcoatl. This is mythology, certainly, but it is mythology that encodes historical processes. Archaeological evidence does suggest significant population movement into central Mexico during the Epic Classic period and the early Post-Classic, roughly 900 to 1000 CE. The pottery styles, architectural forms, and burial practices at Tula show both continuity with earlier central Mexican traditions and new elements that likely came from the north. The city's art prominently features warriors, suggesting that military elites held significant power, but it also shows the sophisticated urban culture of earlier Mesoamerican civilizations. The ballgame, elaborate featherwork, the cult of Quetzalcoatl that had roots stretching back to the Olmecs more than a millennium earlier. Tula, in other words, was indeed a hybrid, a fusion of different cultural streams. Whether this fusion was peaceful or violent, whether it happened in a single generation under leaders like Mixcoatl or gradually over decades, we cannot say with certainty. But the fusion itself is archaeologically demonstrable. What makes the Toltec case particularly interesting is what happened next. In most versions of the barbarian conquest-stand civilization adoption pattern, the warriors become rulers and the conquered peoples become subjects, with cultural exchange flowing both directions, but political power firmly in the hands of the conquerors. The Germanic kingdoms in post-Roman Europe worked this way. Gothic or Frankish warriors formed a military aristocracy, ruling over largely Roman populations. The early Islamic conquests created a similar structure, with Arab Muslims as the ruling class and conquered peoples as subjects, though this would evolve considerably over time. But the Toltec mythology suggests something different, something more radical, a conflict within the ruling elite itself about what values should guide the new civilization. Should Tollan be a warrior state, glorifying military prowess and feeding the gods with the hearts of captured enemies? Or should it be a realm of wisdom and art, where priests and philosophers held higher status than warriors, where symbolic self-sacrifice replaced literal human sacrifice? This conflict was personified in the figure of Topiltzin Quetzalcoatlus, assuming such a person existed. Which brings us to one of the most challenging questions in Mesoamerican history. Was there a historical Tapleton Quetzalcoatl, or is he entirely mythological, a god projected into history to explain the origins of Toltec culture? The honest answer is that we do not know, and probably cannot know with certainty. The sources are clear that a man named Quetzalcoatl Tapiltzin Quetzalcoatl ruled Tollan and attempted significant religious and cultural reforms. Multiple independent sources from different regions of Mesoamerica tell versions of this story, which suggests it has some historical foundation completely. Invented figures rarely appear in multiple independent traditions with consistent details. The chronologies in these sources, when correlated with archaeological evidence, suggest Tapaltzin lived in the mid to late 10th century, perhaps ruling from around 923 to 947 CE, though these dates are highly uncertain. Some scholars are confident that we can extract a historical kernel from the mythology. Others believe the figure is so thoroughly mythologized that the search for a historical person is futile. For our purposes, what matters is not resolving this uncertainty, but understanding what it represents. The character of Tapaltzin Quetzalcoatl, whether historical or legendary, embodies a set of ideas about rulership, religion, and civilization that had profound influence on Mesoamerican thought. He represents the possibility of the philosopher-king, the ruler who governs through wisdom rather than force, who prioritizes culture over conquest, who seeks to elevate humanity rather than simply dominate it. This is an idea with deep roots in human civilization, an idea that has inspired and haunted political philosophy for millennia. 25 centuries ago, Plato imagined a republic governed by philosopher-kings, rulers who had transcended the cave of ignorance and beheld the eternal forms of truth, justice, and the good. These philosopher-kings would rule not for personal gain or glory, but for the welfare of the polis, using their wisdom to create a harmonious and just society. Plato knew this was unlikely to occur. In reality, the entire republic is presented as an ideal rather than a practical program, but the dream itself is important. It expresses the hope that reason and wisdom could guide human affairs, that we might be governed by our better angels rather than our baser instincts, that knowledge could be translated into right action. The history of political philosophy after Plato can be read in part as a series of attempts to realize, modify, or refute this vision. Aristotle, Plato's student, was more skeptical about the possibility of perfect rule, but maintained that political science could identify better and worse forms of government, that wisdom did have a role in governance, even if perfect wisdom was unattainable. The Stoics argued that the sage should engage in politics if circumstances allowed, bringing philosophical principles to bear on practical affairs. Confucian philosophy, developing independently in China around the same time Plato was writing in Greece, advanced remarkably similar ideas. Confucius and his followers argued that rulers should be exemplars of virtue, that governance should be based on moral excellence and ritual propriety rather than mere force. The ideal ruler was the sage king who governed through the power of his moral example. The people would follow him not from fear but from admiration and a desire to emulate his virtue. The Confucian classics are filled with stories of ancient sage kings like Yao, Shun, and Yu, figures who may or may not have been historical, but who functioned as models of virtuous rulership. Even when legalism, with its emphasis on laws and punishments, challenged Confucianism during the Warring States period, it was ultimately a synthesis of Confucian ethics and legalist institutions that shaped Chinese imperial governance. The emperor was expected to be both a moral paragon and an effective administrator, embodying both Wen cultural refinement and virtue and, while capable of Wu military prowess, ideally ruling through the former rather than the latter. Tapaltzin Quetzalcoatl, as he appears in the Aztec sources, fits remarkably well into this tradition of the philosopher-king or sage ruler. He is described as a priest, a scholar, an artist, deeply learned in the mysteries of the calendar and the movements of celestial bodies. He is credited with promoting the arts featherwork, goldsmithing, jade carving, all the crafts that made Tollan legendary. He is said to have practiced rigorous self-discipline, piercing his flesh with maguey thorns to offer his own blood to the gods, rather than demanding the blood of others. Most significantly, he is portrayed as opposing human sacrifice, or at least trying to limit it to symbolic offerings. Instead of the hearts of captive warriors, Quetzalcoatl advocated offerings of butterflies, snakes, and birds. Instead of literal bloodletting, he promoted auto-sacrifice ritual blood drawn from one's own body through piercing. This represented not just a religious reform, but a fundamental challenge to the warrior culture that dominated Mesoamerica. If warriors derived their status from capturing prisoners for sacrifice, and if sacrifice is how communities prove their devotion to the gods, then the warrior elite has a powerful ideological foundation for their dominance. They are not merely extracting tribute or gratifying their lust for power. They are performing the essential cosmic function of feeding the gods, keeping the sun rising and the world in existence. This is not cynical propaganda imposed from above. Many cultures have believed with genuine conviction that the gods require sacrifice, that human blood has special power to sustain divine beings or cosmic processes. The logic, however alien to modern sensibilities, is coherent. The gods gave us life and sustenance. Therefore, we owe them the return gift of our most precious substance, our blood, the vehicle of our life force. In most cultures, this obligation is discharged through animal sacrifice, and the animals are usually consumed by the human participants, making sacrifice also a form of ritual feasting that strengthens community bonds. But Mesoamerican religion pushed this logic to its extreme conclusion. If blood is precious, human blood is most precious of all. If the gods require feeding, then the hearts of human beings, torn from the chest while still beating, provide the ultimate nourishment. This is not gratuitous cruelty, but sacred duty, and the sacrificial victim is not a mere criminal or slave, but often a warrior who has proven his courage in battle, whose strength and valor make him a worthy offering. Some sources suggest that captives were ritually adopted into the capturing community before being sacrificed, becoming symbolic sons who give their lives to sustain their adoptive fathers. The psychology here is complex. It combines genuine religious conviction, the glorification of military values, the creation of shared identity through participation in transgressive acts, and probably elements of terror and social control. When Quetzalcoatl challenged this system, he was not simply proposing a different religious practice. He was threatening the entire ideological foundation of warrior dominance. This brings us to the heart of the Toltec drama, the conflict that would determine the character of Mesoamerican civilization for centuries to come. Quetzalcoatl represented one vision, a civilization built on knowledge, art, self-discipline, and limited violence. His rival in the mythology was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of warriors, god of fate and discord, master of the night sky. Where Quetzalcoatl was associated with the morning star Venus in its aspect as herald of the dawn, Tezcatlipoca was the night itself, mysterious and dangerous. Where Quetzalcoatl represented order, learning, and predictability, Tezcatlipoca represented chaos, cunning, and the unexpected. The mythology presents their conflict in terms of divine struggle, but encoded within this celestial battle is a very human political struggle between competing factions and visions of society. The most famous version of this story appears in multiple sources, with variations, but a consistent core narrative. Tezcatlipoca, envious of Quetzalcoatl's rule and opposed to his reforms, conspired to destroy him. Disguised as an old man, he appeared before Quetzalcoatl, bearing pulque, the fermented maguey drink that was central to Mesoamerican ritual life. Quetzalcoatl initially refused. He was an ascetic who avoided intoxication, but Tezcatlipoca was persuasive. Just a taste, he suggested, for medicinal purposes, to restore the king's strength. Quetzalcoatl drank, and then drank again, and soon he was thoroughly intoxicated. In his drunkenness, he sent for his sister, Quetzalcoatl, and together they committed incest, violating fundamental taboos. Other versions include additional degradations. The philosopher-king, behaving in ways that contradicted all his teachings about self-control and proper conduct. When Quetzalcoatl awoke and realized what he had done, he was consumed with shame. He had demonstrated that he was no better than ordinary humans, subject to the same weaknesses and passions, capable of the same sins. His moral authority was destroyed. He could not remain as ruler, so he prepared to depart from Tollan. He burned his houses of gold and silver, buried his treasures, transformed his precious cacao trees into mesquite. Then he set out toward the east, toward the ocean. His followers accompanied him part of the way, but eventually he sent them back. At the shore, accounts differ. In some versions, he immolated himself on a funeral pyre, and his heart rose to become the morning star Venus. In others, he sailed away on a raft of serpents, promising to return in a year named One Reed, which occurred every 52 years in the Mesoamerican calendar cycle. This prophecy of return would have fateful consequences when courts arrived in Mexico in 1519 a year. One Reed, though most scholars now doubt that Moctezuma actually believed courts was the returning Quetzalcoatl, that identification likely emerged after the conquest as a way to make sense of the catastrophe. What are we to make of this story? On one level, it functions as a cosmic myth explaining the relationship between different gods and their spheres of influence. But the political allegory is transparent. A reformist leader who tries to change established practices faces opposition from entrenched interests. His enemies do not meet him in open debate or honest conflict that might fail and might make martyrs. Instead, they undermine his moral authority, revealing or creating scandals that make his position untenable. The specific scandal drunkenness and incest touches on deep cultural anxieties. Pulque was both sacred and dangerous, a drink of the gods that could also reduce humans to bestial behavior. Its consumption was heavily regulated, generally restricted to elders or specific ritual contexts. For a priest-king to become drunk and commit incest suggested a catastrophic failure of self-control, precisely the quality that supposedly justified his authority. If the philosopher-king cannot master his own passions, how can he presume to guide others? This pattern the reformist leader brought down by scandal, real or fabricated, appears throughout history. Socrates, Plato's teacher, and the model philosopher, was executed by Athens on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Whether these charges had any merit is debatable. What matters is that they were effective in destroying him. Religious reformers, from Jan Hus to Martin Luther, faced accusations of heresy and moral failure. Political reformers in every age have found their personal lives scrutinized, their human flaws magnified to delegitimize their ideas. The ad hominem attack, focusing on the person rather than their arguments, is fallacious in formal logic, but often devastatingly effective in political reality. If you can make people doubt the moral character of a leader, you can undermine their entire program without ever addressing its merits. But there is another interpretation of the Quetzalcoatl story, one that is perhaps more troubling, but also more profound. Perhaps Tapaltzin's fall reveals not the machinations of his enemies, but the inherent limitations of philosopher-kingship itself. Plato's vision of the philosopher-king assumed that knowledge of the good would translate into right action, that one who truly understood virtue would necessarily act virtuously. But human psychology is more complex than this. We can know what is right and still do what is wrong. We can understand abstract principles while failing to apply them in concrete situations. We can be wise about cosmic matters while foolish about personal ones. Paul of Tarsus captured this frustration in his letter to the Romans. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. This gap between knowledge and action, between ideals and practice, haunts every ethical system. Moreover, the qualities that make someone an effective philosopher or scholar may not be the same. Qualities needed for effective political leadership. Philosophers deal in abstraction, in universal principles, in logical consistency. Politicians deal in concrete situations, in competing interests, in pragmatic compromise. A ruler who insists on philosophical purity may be unable to make the morally ambiguous choices that political reality demands. They may be paralyzed by awareness of complexity, seeing all sides of every question, unable to commit to necessary action. Or they may become dogmatic, trying to impose theoretical models on situations that require flexibility and adaptation. Either way, the translation from philosophy to politics is not straightforward. The Confucian tradition wrestled with this problem for centuries. The ideal of the sage king who rules through moral virtue is beautiful, but in practice, Confucian officials often found themselves serving rulers who were anything but sage-like. How should a virtuous minister serve an unvirtuous emperor? Should they withdraw from political life entirely, maintaining their personal integrity but abandoning any hope of improving governance? Should they compromise their principles to achieve some good within a flawed system? Should they resist openly, even at the cost of their lives, to bear witness to what is right, even if ineffective? These questions divided Confucian thinkers and continue to resonate in contemporary debates about political engagement and moral compromise. Tapaltzin Quetzalcoatl, in the mythology, chose withdrawal. Faced with the collapse of his moral authority, he left Tollan rather than rule through force alone. This can be read as admirable. He refused to become a hypocrite, clinging to power after demonstrating his unworthiness. It can also be read as a failure. He abandoned his people and his reforms rather than fight for them through the available means. The warrior faction, represented by Tezcatlipoca, had no such qualms. They were willing to use whatever methods necessary to gain and maintain power. And so Tollan became what they wanted it to be, a militarized empire built on conquest and sacrifice, successful by conventional measures, but far from the philosophical ideal Quetzalcoatl had envisioned. This outcome suggests a disturbing possibility that in political competition, the ruthless often defeat the scrupulous, not because ruthlessness is somehow more true or valid, but simply because those willing to use any means have more tools at their disposal than those constrained by ethical principles. This is essentially the argument advanced by Machiavelli in The Prince. A ruler who wants to do good must first secure and maintain power, and this may require actions that appear evil by conventional morality. The idealist who refuses to dirty their hands will be swept aside by those who have no such compunctions. And all the idealists' good intentions will accomplish nothing. Better, Machiavelli suggests, to be a Tezcatlipoca who accomplishes some good than a Quetzalcoatl whose noble failure leaves the field to worse actors. But we should not push this interpretation too far. The mythology also contains a counter-narrative, one that would shape Mesoamerican civilization for the next 5 centuries. Quetzalcoatl may have been defeated in the immediate political struggle, but his vision did not die with his departure. The myth of Tollan, as a golden age, as a realm of art and wisdom, persisted precisely because it represented values that people continued to honor even when those values were not realized in practice. The Toltecs in their actual historical existence were indeed a militarized society, but they also produced remarkable art, maintained extensive trade networks, developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and created an urban culture that subsequent civilizations admired and emulated. Somehow, both impulses coexisted, the warrior and the artist, Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl, force and culture. This coexistence, this tension between competing values that are never fully reconciled, may be closer to the reality of actual civilizations than any single unified vision. Societies are not coherent philosophical systems. They are assemblages of contradictions, institutions serving different purposes, different groups with different interests and values, all held together by some combination of shared identity, practical interdependence, and the apparatus of state power. The mythology of Quetzalcoatl versus Tezcatlipoca, rather than describing a simple conflict with a clear victor, may actually capture something profound about the permanent duality within civilization itself, the necessary but never fully resolved tension between the creative and the destructive, between culture and power, between the aspirations of the ideal and the compromises of the real. After Tapleson's departure, Tollan did not collapse. In fact, it entered its period of greatest power and expansion. This is the Toltec civilization that archaeologists have uncovered at Tula, the one that appears in the material record as a significant regional power from roughly 950 to 1150 CE. The city at its height covered approximately 15 square kilometers and housed perhaps 30 to 60,000 people, large by Mesoamerican standards, though not as large as Teotihuacan in its heyday. The urban plan was organized around a massive central precinct dominated by Pyramid B, known as the Pyramid of Tlaviscalpantu, the Lord of the House of Dawn, one of the aspects of Quetzalcoatl. The irony is worth noting. The city allegedly taken over by Quetzalcoatl's enemies still placed one of his pyramids at its ceremonial center. Perhaps this reflects the political need to maintain some continuity even while changing the substance of rule. Perhaps different factions found ways to accommodate each other. Or perhaps the stark dichotomy of the mythology simplifies a more complex political reality. The most famous features of this pyramid are the Atlantid figures that crown it, massive stone warriors, each over 4.5 meters tall, originally supporting the roof of a temple. These warriors are shown in full military regalia, carrying atlat's spear throwers, wearing elaborate butterfly pectorals, and adorned with feathered headdresses. They stare out across the landscape with an expression that seems simultaneously alert and impassive, guardians frozen in stone yet somehow still watchful. These figures have become iconic representations of Toltec culture, and they communicate something important about what Tollan became after Tapleson's departure. This was a warrior society, one that celebrated military prowess and organized itself around the needs and values of its fighting elite. The architecture of the central precinct reinforces this impression. The burnt palace, a large colonnaded hall, likely served as a gathering place for warrior orders. The columns that supported its roof are carved with representations of warriors in processional formation, each figure distinctive in its details, yet following a consistent compositional scheme. This is military pageantry rendered in stone, a permanent record of the warrior elite who dominated Toltec society. The Chacmol sculptures found at Tula, reclining figures with heads turned to the side, bellies configured to hold offerings, were likely repositories for the hearts of sacrificial victims. The Tezampanli, or skull rack, platforms where the skulls of sacrificed prisoners were displayed, announced to all visitors the city's martial success and its devotion to the gods who demanded blood. This militarization of Toltec culture was not unique to Tollan. It reflected broader patterns in post-classic Mesoamerica. The period from roughly 900 to 1521 CE across the region, cities became more fortified, warrior imagery more prominent, evidence of human sacrifice more abundant. This shift had multiple causes. The collapse of the classic period hegemonist Teotihuacan in central Mexico, multiple Maya centers in the southern lowlands created a more competitive political environment. Without dominant powers to impose order, smaller states competed more aggressively for resources, territory, and prestige. Climate change may have intensified these competitions. Paleoclimatic data suggests that the 9th and 10th centuries saw periods of drought in Mesoamerica, which would have stressed agricultural systems and made control of reliable water sources more valuable and contested. But there was also an ideological dimension to this militarization. The post-classic saw the rise of what scholars sometimes call the Mesoamerican international style, shared set of religious symbols, architectural forms, and artistic motifs that appeared across diverse regions and language groups. Central to this style was an emphasis on warfare and sacrifice as cosmic necessities. The gods required nourishment in the form of human blood to keep the universe functioning. The sun needed strength to rise each morning and defeat the forces of darkness. Human beings had an obligation to provide this sustenance through warfare and sacrifice. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone went directly to paradise, accompanying the sun on its journey across the sky. This ideology provided powerful motivation for military expansion, while also legitimizing the dominance of warrior elites. Tula was a major node in the spread of this international style. Toltec artistic and architectural influence appears at sites across Mesoamerica, most famously at Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. The similarities between Tula and Chichen Itza are striking. Nearly identical Atlantid columns, similar throne forms, comparable ball court layouts, shared iconographic motifs, including the feathered serpent, warriors, eagles, devouring hearts. For decades, archaeologists debated what these similarities meant. Did Toltecs conquer Chichen Itza? Did Maya from Chichen Itza conquer Tula? Was there a peaceful alliance or shared religious movement? More recent scholarship suggests the relationship was complex and probably not unidirectional. Both cities were participants in a shared cultural sphere, with elites adopting similar symbols and styles to participate in a prestige system that transcended linguistic and ethnic boundaries. This pattern of cultural exchange through elite networks appears in many historical contexts. During the Hellenistic period, following Alexander's conquests, Greek cultural forms spread across the ancient Near East, not primarily through force, but because local elites saw advantage in adopting Greek styles, learning the Greek language, patronizing Greek-style art and architecture. This created a superficial cultural unity across a politically fragmented world. The elites of Egypt, Syria, Bactria, and dozens of other regions all participated in a shared Hellenistic culture, even as they competed politically. Similarly, during the medieval period, European elites from Ireland to Poland participated in a shared Latin Christian culture, with similar architectural styles for churches, similar liturgical practices, similar manuscript illumination traditions. This cultural unity coexisted with intense political fragmentation and frequent warfare. The Mesoamerican international style worked similarly. Cities across different regions adopted similar architectural forms and religious symbols to signal their participation in a shared prestige system. This facilitated trade, diplomatic relations, and the movement of specialists. It also facilitated warfare, ironically, by creating common symbolic languages for conducting negotiations, exchanging hostages, and ritualizing conflict. The ball game, which appears at Toltec sites and across Mesoamerica, could serve as both substitute for warfare, ritualized competition with cosmic significance, and preparation for it, training in the kinds of coordinated movement and strategic thinking that warfare required. The game's association with human sacrifice, losing teams or individual players were sometimes sacrificed, though the details varied by region and period-linked athletic competition, warfare, and religious ritual into a unified complex. Tula's role in this system brought both wealth and pressure. Archaeological evidence shows that the city had access to resources from across Mesoamerica, obsidian from multiple sources, including the Pachuca mines, that Teotihuacan had controlled turquoise from what is now the American Southwest, cacao from tropical lowlands, fine pottery from specialized production centers. This implies extensive trade networks and possibly tributary relationships. The city's workshops produced crafts for export, obsidian tools, pottery, possibly textiles and featherwork, though these perishable goods rarely survive archaeologically. This economic integration was source of prosperity, but also vulnerability. Maintaining trade networks required military power to protect routes and enforce agreements. It required diplomatic skill to manage relationships with other centers. It required a steady supply of prestige goods to reward allies and impress rivals. The economic logic of Toltec imperialism resembles that of other pre-modern empires. The Roman Empire extracted grain, wine, oil, metals, slaves, and other resources from its provinces, using this wealth to support the city of Rome, pay the legions, and fund the apparatus of imperial administration. The Chinese tributary system brought silk, tea, porcelain, and other goods from China to neighbors and vassals. With the system structured to demonstrate Chinese superiority while also facilitating beneficial trade, the Aztec Empire, which would explicitly model itself on Toltec precedents, developed an elaborate tribute system that brought everything from basic foodstuffs to exotic luxuries into Tenochtitlan. In each case, empire provided certain benefits: protection from external enemies, resolution of disputes, infrastructure for trade, but these benefits were unevenly distributed, with the imperial center and its elites capturing most of the gains. Within Tula itself, this wealth was not equally shared. Archaeological evidence of residential compounds shows clear status differences. Some compounds have elaborate decoration, evidence of imported goods, specialized craft production. Others are much simpler, with basic domestic pottery and little ornamentation. This is unsurprising. All complex societies show some degree of inequality, but it's worth noting because the mythology of Tollan emphasizes abundance for all, not just elite luxury. The reality was more typical: a wealthy minority living very well, a larger population of craftspeople and farmers living adequately, and probably a subordinated population of lower status performing the most onerous labor. Human inequality, like human violence, tends to increase as societies grow more complex. Not because complexity itself is bad, but because complexity creates more opportunities for some people to control resources and extract value from others' labor. This inequality intersected with the warrior culture in predictable ways. Successful warriors could claim prestigious captives, gain access to ritual roles, receive tribute from conquered regions. Military service offered one of the few paths to social mobility. A farmer's son who proved exceptional in battle might rise to warrior elite status. But this meant that the society was structured to reward violence and channel ambition into military expansion. Peace, by this logic, threatened the system. Without warfare, how would young men prove themselves? How would the gods receive the hearts they required? How would the tribute system be maintained? Warrior societies tend toward expansion for both material and ideological reasons. They need external enemies to raid for resources and captives, and they need the ideology of external threat to justify their own dominance. The Spartans of ancient Greece created perhaps the most extreme version of this pattern. Spartan society was entirely organized around military excellence, with boys taken from their families at age 7 for brutal military training, adult men living in barracks and dining in common, the entire citizen body, essentially a permanent military camp. This system produced what was arguably the finest infantry in Greece, capable of defeating forces several times their number. But it was also incredibly rigid and ultimately fragile. Sparta was always outnumbered by the Helots, the enslaved population that actually produced the food and goods Spartans consumed. The system required constant vigilance and periodic terror to keep the Helots subjugated, and Spartans' obsession with maintaining their traditional ways prevented adaptation when circumstances changed. When Macedonia introduced new military technologies and tactics, Sparta could not match them while preserving the institutions that made Spartans Spartan. Tula did not reach Spartan levels of militarization. It maintained craft production, trade, religious institutions beyond simply warrior cults. But the comparison illuminates the tensions inherent in warrior-dominated societies. The skills and values needed for military success are not identical to those needed for urban administration, agricultural management, craft production, trade negotiations, or any of the other activities that make complex societies function. A society that gives highest prestige and power to warriors may find that warriors make decisions optimized for military outcomes rather than social welfare. They may undervalue the merchants, farmers, and craftspeople who actually create wealth, seeing them as inferior to those who take wealth through force. This tension appears in many cultures. Medieval European aristocrats were defined by their military function. They fought, while peasants worked and clergy prayed. This military function justified their extraction of agricultural surplus from peasants, their control of land and political power. But it also meant that many aristocrats viewed commerce with contempt, seeing merchants as beneath them, despite often being poorer than successful merchants. The samurai of Japan underwent a similar evolution. Originally rural warriors, they became urbanized administrators during the Tokugawa period 1603 to 1868, learning to manage finances, adjudicate disputes, implement policy. But they maintained an ideology that privileged martial values and looked down on merchants, creating cognitive dissonance as they became in practice bureaucrats while in theory remaining warriors. Toltec culture seems to have navigated this tension by maintaining the myth of Quetzalcoatl alongside the reality of Tezcatlipoca. The city celebrated its warriors, but also its craftspeople. The same elites who depicted themselves as fierce fighters also commissioned elaborate artworks, studied astronomy, maintained calendrical knowledge. The term Toltec itself became synonymous with civilized artisan, suggesting that craft skill retained prestige even in a warrior-dominated society. This is evident in the quality of Toltec art that survives. The stone carving is technically sophisticated and aesthetically refined. The metal work, including copper bells, gold ornaments, shows understanding of complex techniques. The surviving murals and sculptural programs demonstrate careful planning and skilled execution. Perhaps, then, the Toltec achievement was precisely this synthesis of warrior and artist. Force and culture, Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. Neither vision triumphed completely. Neither was entirely suppressed. The civilization that emerged from their conflict embodied both, holding contradictory impulses in unstable but productive tension. This may not satisfy those who want clear moral lessons or simple narratives of progress and decline, but it corresponds to the complexity of actual historical societies. Rome celebrated both military virtue and Greek learning, producing warrior poets like Julius Caesar, who could slaughter Gauls by the 100,000 and write elegant Latin prose about it. Islamic civilization under the Abbasids glorified both jihad struggle, including military struggle, and ilm knowledge, producing scholars who made fundamental advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, while also celebrating military conquests. Medieval European universities taught both theology and the martial arts to young nobles, seeing both as appropriate to their station. But synthesis and balance are difficult to maintain. They require institutions that can mediate competing interests, ideologies flexible enough to accommodate contradiction, and often a degree of prosperity that allows different groups to all receive sufficient rewards, that they don't tear the system apart, fighting over the scraps. When any of these conditions fail, synthesis can collapse into conflict, balance into fragmentation. And around the year 1150, something went catastrophically wrong at Tula. The archaeological evidence for Tula's collapse is unambiguous: widespread burning, destruction of monuments, abandonment of the city. The pyramid of Tlahuacalpantu shows signs of deliberate damage: columns knocked down, sculptures defaced. The burnt palace lives up to its name, with clear evidence of conflagration. Residential areas were abandoned relatively quickly, with some signs of selective removal of valuable items, but also much material left behind, suggesting disruption rather than planned migration. By around 1200, the city was largely empty, its population dispersed, its regional dominance ended. What caused this collapse is less clear. One possibility is environmental stress. Paleoclimatic reconstructions suggest drought conditions in central Mexico during the 12th century. Drought would have reduced agricultural productivity, making it harder to feed the urban population and maintain the surplus needed for specialists, trade, and military campaigns. This could create a cascading failure. Reduced agricultural output leads to food shortages, which lead to social unrest, which disrupts trade and tribute collection, which reduces the state's capacity to respond to the crisis, which allows further deterioration. The classic Maya collapse, which occurred a few centuries earlier but followed similar patterns, seems to have been triggered in part by sustained drought that stressed agricultural systems past the breaking point. When the environmental foundations of a civilization erode, the social and political superstructure built on those foundations becomes vulnerable. But drought alone rarely causes civilizational collapse. Many societies weather severe climate shocks without disintegrating. What seems to matter more is the interaction between environmental stress and social factors, the resilience of institutions, the distribution of resources, the presence of conflict or cooperation, the ability to adapt practices to changing conditions. Jared Diamond, in his comparative study of societal collapse, identifies several factors that make societies vulnerable. Environmental damage, sometimes self-inflicted through practices like deforestation or soil depletion, climate change, hostile neighbors, loss of trading partners, and especially the society's responses to these challenges. Some societies recognize problems early and take effective action. Others fail to perceive the problem, fail to agree on solutions, or pursue solutions that don't work or make things worse. Tula may have contributed to its own vulnerability through its economic and political structure. The tributary empire model concentrates resources at the center, making the imperial capital dependent on continuous extraction from the periphery. If tributary regions can successfully resist, or if environmental problems disrupt their production, the center starves, even if some outlying areas remain productive. The military emphasis of Toltec culture may have meant too many people were supported as warriors rather than as food producers, creating a top-heavy structure vulnerable to any disruption of tribute flows. The warrior ideology itself, with its emphasis on expansion and conquest, may have prevented the kind of adaptive responses, reducing population, intensifying local agricultural production, shifting to less resource-intensive economic models that could have enhanced resilience. There is also evidence of internal conflict. Some destroyed monuments at Tula show selective defacement, particular symbols or figures targeted rather than random destruction. This suggests factional violence, perhaps different groups within Toltec society fighting for control as the system broke down. When civilizations collapse, they rarely go quietly. More often there is a period of increasing conflict, desperate attempts to maintain the old system, scapegoating of particular groups or leaders, and sometimes a final paroxysm of violence as the structure comes apart. The burning of elite residences and temples at Tula might represent popular uprising against the ruling class, or it might represent factional warfare among elites themselves, or possibly ritual termination, the deliberate destruction and burial of sacred structures when a place is abandoned, a way of closing one cosmic cycle and potentially enabling a new one. Archaeological evidence also points to pressure from external groups. Northern frontier regions show signs of disruption around this period, possibly indicating Chichimec incursions. These new groups from the north, like the Chichimecs, who had helped found Toltec civilization centuries earlier, may have been pushed south by environmental changes in the more arid regions they inhabited. They may have been attracted by Tula's wealth, seeing a profitable target for raiding, or they may simply have been migrating in search of better conditions and came into conflict with Toltec border defenses. Whatever the specific mechanism, the pattern recurs in history. Civilizations often face external pressure exactly when they are weakened by internal problems. The combination is frequently deadly. Rome in the 5th century CE faced both internal crisis, political instability, economic disruption, military weakness, social fragmentation, and external pressure from Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine and Danube. Neither factor alone would necessarily have been fatal, but together they overwhelmed the Western Empire's capacity to respond. The 10th dynasty in China collapsed in the early 10th century after decades of internal rebellion weakened central authority, making it impossible to defend against external threats. The classic Maya collapse involved both environmental stress and warfare among Maya states, with each factor exacerbating the other. Tula in the 12th century seems to fit this pattern. Environmental stress, reducing resources, internal conflict over how to respond, external pressure from northern groups, all interacting to create systemic failure. But we should be careful not to view collapse solely as disaster. For the elites of Tula, for those invested in the existing system, collapse was certainly catastrophic. The loss of their wealth, power, status, possibly their lives. But for many ordinary people, for tributary populations who had been supplying goods to Tula, for rival cities that could now compete for regional influence, the collapse created opportunities. This is not to romanticize collapse or minimize its human cost. Periods of civilizational transition are usually marked by increased violence, disrupted trade, reduced agricultural productivity, population displacement, all of which cause immense suffering. But they also open space for new social arrangements, for people and groups who were subordinated under the old system to try different ways of organizing themselves. The period following Tula's collapse, sometimes called the Chichimeca interregnum, saw central Mexico fragment into competing city-states, Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco, and eventually Tenochtitlan, among others. This fragmentation meant more warfare, in some ways more borders to defend, more rivals competing for resources and prestige. But it also meant more diversity of political organization, more experiments in governance, more opportunities for movement and change. The Mexica, who would become the Aztecs, arrived as one more group of Chichimeca migrants, initially despised and assigned the worst land. Within 2 centuries, through a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, and political innovation, they would dominate an empire larger than Tula's. This was possible partly because the collapse of Tula had created a power vacuum and political fluidity that did not exist during Toltec hegemony. Joseph Tainter, in his study of collapse, argues that civilizations become increasingly complex over time, developing more specialized roles, more hierarchical structures, more elaborate institutions to manage coordination problems. This complexity provides benefits: more efficient production, more sophisticated technology, more capacity to mobilize resources for large projects. But complexity also has costs. It requires more energy and resources to maintain, becomes more fragile as different components become interdependent, and eventually reaches diminishing returns where additional complexity costs more than it benefits. At that point, systems can collapse to a simpler level of organization, which, from the perspective of complexity theory, is not necessarily regression, but rather right-sizing to match available resources and coordination capacity. Tula's collapse might be understood this way. The Toltec system of tributary empire, specialist craft production, long-distance trade, religious hierarchy, military organization, all this complexity required continuous input of resources and effort to maintain. When those inputs became insufficient, the complex structure could not be sustained. What replaced it was not chaos, but simpler political units, operating at a scale they could actually manage, given available resources. These smaller units preserved many elements of Toltec culture. The same gods were worshipped, many of the same craft, techniques practiced, the calendar and ritual system continued, but the political superstructure that had integrated these elements into an empire was abandoned as too costly to maintain. Yet even as the political structure collapsed, the cultural memory of Tollan intensified. This is the paradox at the heart of Toltec legacy. The real city of Tula became more mythologically powerful as it became politically weaker. The ruins became sacred sites, pilgrimage destinations, sources of legitimacy for anyone who could claim connection to them. The farther in time people were from the actual Toltec state, the more perfect that state appeared in retrospect. By the time the Aztecs rose to power in the 15th century, Tollan had been transformed from a historical place into a timeless archetype, the model of what civilization should aspire to be. This transformation of history into mythology is a universal human process. The past is always more perfect than the present, at least in selective memory, because we remember the achievements while forgetting the problems, celebrate the glories while overlooking the crimes, see the completed edifice while ignoring the scaffolding and struggle that constructed it. The Aztecs needed a glorious Toltec past to legitimize their own power. They claimed descent from Toltec nobility through the rulers of Culhuacan, who had absorbed refugees from Tula after its collapse. They sent expeditions to the ruins to collect fragments of Toltec craftsmanship. They consulted what they believed were ancient Toltec codices for ritual and calendrical knowledge. They called their own finest artisans Toltecs, implying that true mastery was always a recovery of ancient wisdom rather than modern innovation. This idealization of the past had real consequences for Aztec culture. On one hand, it encouraged excellence in arts and craftsmanship, as artisans strove to match what were believed to be Toltec standards. It provided cultural continuity, linking the Aztec present to a deeper Mesoamerican past. It created shared reference points across different regions and ethnic groups. Everyone knew the stories of Tollan and Quetzalcoatl, providing common ground for diplomatic and cultural exchange. On the other hand, it may have limited innovation, if the highest goal was always to recover past wisdom rather than create new knowledge. It created a certain fatalism, visible in Aztec thought, about the inevitable decline of each cosmic age. Tollan had fallen despite its perfection. How could the Aztecs hope to do better? The myth of Quetzalcoatl's return became particularly important in Aztec eschatology. According to some interpretations of the calendar, the god-king, who had departed to the east, would return in a year one reed to reclaim his kingdom. This prophecy created a cyclical tension in Aztec time every 52 years. When the calendar cycle completed and a one-reed year arrived, there was a possibility of cosmic transformation. The Aztecs marked these cycle completions with the new fire ceremony, extinguishing all fires in the empire, and ritually rekindling them, symbolizing the renewal of the cosmos and the deferral of apocalypse for another cycle. Whether ordinary Aztecs genuinely feared that Quetzalcoatl might return and overthrow the existing order, or whether this was more a matter of ritual observance that people went through without literal belief, is difficult to say. Religious belief is complex and often contains contradictory elements held simultaneously without apparent contradiction. What is certain is that after the Spanish conquest, this mythology of return was retrofitted to explain the catastrophe. Spanish chroniclers and indigenous informants working with them in the colonial period recorded stories that Moctezuma II had believed Quartz was the returning Quetzalcoatl, that this explained his initial vacillation in responding to the Spanish presence. Modern scholars are skeptical of this claim. It appears in sources written after the conquest, when both Spanish and indigenous people had reasons to construct narratives that explained the fall of the Aztec Empire in cosmic or religious terms, rather than purely military ones. Moctezuma's actual motivations in 1519 were probably more prosaic uncertainty about Spanish capabilities and intentions, concern about alienating powerful vassal states, awareness of internal opposition to his rule, calculation about the costs and benefits of different responses. But the fact that this narrative was constructed tells us something important. People needed Quetzalcoatl's return to explain the conquest because pure military defeat was insufficient explanation for such a total transformation of their world. The Spanish were numerically tiny, a few hundred conquistadors plus indigenous allies against an empire of millions. Their technological advantages were real but not overwhelming: horses, steel weapons, a few small cannon versus obsidian-edged weapons, and cotton armor, which were effective in their own right. What truly defeated the Aztecs was the catastrophic epidemic disease that the Spanish unwittingly brought, particularly smallpox, which killed perhaps 30 to 50% of the population within a few years. But disease is not an emotionally satisfying explanation for conquest. It's random, meaningless, not amenable to narrative. The return of Quetzalcoatl, the culmination of a prophecy centuries old, the working out of cosmic cycles, this provides meaning, terrible meaning, but meaning nonetheless. The transformation of Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl from a historical or legendary priest-king into a mythological figure whose return would signal cosmic transformation reflects the human need to find pattern and purpose in catastrophe. When our world ends, we want it to mean something, to fit into some larger story. The mythology of Tollan, of Quetzalcoatl, and Tezcatlipoca, of the eternal tension between wisdom and power, between board, art, and war, between the ideals we profess and the compromises we make, this mythology provided Mesoamerican civilizations with a framework for understanding their history and imagining their future, that it was built on imperfect memory of historical events, that it idealized and distorted the actual Toltec civilization beyond recognition, does not diminish its importance. Myths are not inferior to facts. They serve different functions, answer different questions, operate at different levels of meaning. What, then, should we take from the story of Tollan and its philosopher-king? What does this vanished civilization and its transformation into myth reveal about the human condition, about the possibilities and limitations of political order, about the relationship between power and culture? First, the Toltec experience reminds us that the tension between force and persuasion, between power and legitimacy is fundamental to political life. Every state, every government, every system of authority rests ultimately on some combination of the capacity to compel obedience and the ability to win consent. Pure force is unstable. It requires constant vigilance, cannot survive succession crises, generates resistance that must be continually suppressed. Pure persuasion is insufficient. There are always some who will not be persuaded. Conflicts that cannot be resolved through dialogue, external threats that must be met with organized violence. The question is not whether to use force or not, but what balance to strike between coercion and consent, between the warrior and the philosopher, between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. The mythology of Tepiltzin. Quetzalcoatl represents an attempt to imagine rule based primarily on wisdom and moral authority rather than martial prowess. The story acknowledges that this attempt failed, at least in its pure form. The philosopher-king was defeated by his warrior rivals. Tollan became a military empire. Human sacrifice and conquest defined Toltec civilization at its height. But the dream of the philosopher-king did not die. It persisted in cultural memory, shaped how subsequent civilizations understood themselves, provided a critical standard against which actual rulers could be measured and found wanting. The myth kept alive the possibility that things could be otherwise, that wisdom might yet rule, even if that possibility was never fully realized. This pattern, the failed reformer who becomes more powerful as memory than as reality, peers throughout history. Socrates was executed by Athens. His philosophical mission apparently ended in failure. But his student Plato wrote dialogues that immortalized Socratic method and made Socrates the paradigmatic philosopher, more influential dead than he ever was alive. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified as a failed messianic claimant, his movement seemingly crushed, but his followers transformed defeat into victory through the resurrection narrative, and Christianity went on to reshape Western civilization. In both cases, as with Quetzalcoatl, the historical figure becomes mythologized, and the myth proves more durable and influential than any political victory could have been. Second, the Toltec story illuminates the complexity of civilizational achievement. We want to celebrate Toltec artistry, astronomical knowledge, urban planning, and long-distance trade, while condemning their human sacrifice and military expansion. We want to separate the good from the bad, preserve what we admire, and reject what we find abhorrent. But this separation may be impossible. The artisans who created beautiful featherwork and gold jewelry were supported by tribute extracted through military conquest. The astronomical knowledge was used in part to determine optimal times for sacrifice and warfare. The cities, however impressive their architecture, were built on fundamental inequality between nobles and commoners, with an underclass of laborers whose lives we know almost nothing about because they left no records. This does not mean we must accept a moral relativism where all civilizations are equally valid or where critique is impossible. It means we must reckon with the fact that great cultural achievements have often been built on systems we would now consider unjust or cruel. Classical Athens, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, was a slave society where the majority of residents had no political rights. The European Renaissance and Enlightenment coincided with the Atlantic slave trade and colonial conquest. The Industrial Revolution that created modern prosperity involved brutal working conditions and environmental devastation. In each case, the question is not whether we can find pure examples of good civilizations. We cannot. but whether we can learn from both the achievements and the failures, appreciating what was accomplished while understanding the costs at which it came. Third, the Toltec collapse and its transformation into myth demonstrates the power of cultural memory in shaping identity and action. The real city of Tula, with its complicated mixture of artistry and violence, its brief florescence and catastrophic collapse, was less important for subsequent Mesoamerican history than the mythological Tollan. What the Aztecs believed about the Toltecs influenced how they structured their own society, how they legitimized their conquests, how they understood their place in the cosmos. Accurate historical knowledge mattered less than serviceable mythology. This is not unique to the Aztecs. All nations, all cultures, all civilizations construct founding myths that may have tenuous relationship to historical fact, but serve crucial functions of identity formation and political legitimization. American origin mythology, for example, emphasizes religious freedom, individual liberty, and democratic governance, overlooking or minimizing the genocide of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Africans that were equally central to the colonial and early national periods. French Republican mythology celebrates the Revolution of 1789 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, while being more ambivalent about the terror that followed. Chinese civilization constructs a narrative of 5,000 years of continuous cultural tradition, which is true in some senses, but obscures the many discontinuities, conquests, and transformations that actually characterized Chinese history. None of these examples are pure fabrication. There are historical foundations to each myth, but all are selective memories that serve present needs as much as they preserve past truth. The question is not whether we can do without such myths. We probably cannot, but whether we can hold them lightly enough to revise them when necessary, honestly enough to acknowledge their partial and constructed nature, critically enough to resist their most destructive implications. The Aztec mythology of Tollan provided cultural continuity and legitimacy, but it may also have contributed to a certain fatalism about the possibility of lasting achievement. If even perfect Tollan fell, how could any human creation endure? This pessimism appears in Aztec poetry and philosophy, particularly in the Nahuatl concept of Nikan Mopohua. Nothing lasts on earth, the transience and vanity of all earthly things. This could produce profound wisdom about the human condition, but it might also create paralysis or justify cruelty if nothing ultimately matters. Why restrain yourself? Fourth, the story of Tollan raises questions about the relationship between civilization and violence that remain unresolved. The classic narrative of civilization is that it represents the overcoming of violence through law, reason, culture, that we progress from barbarism to civility, from Habesian war, of all against all, to ordered society. But the archaeological record tells a different story. The emergence of complex societies generally correlates with increased evidence of violence, not its elimination. Warfare becomes more organized and more destructive as societies develop more sophisticated military technologies and institutions. Inequality increases, creating structural violence where some people's life chances are systematically worse than others due to their position in the social hierarchy. The apparatus of the state police prisons courts represents not the elimination of violence, but its monopolization and routinization. Mesoamerican civilizations are unusual in making this violence so visible and explicit through their practice of human sacrifice. But was Toltec or Aztec sacrifice fundamentally different from Roman gladiatorial games, where thousands of men and animals were killed for public entertainment, or from European public executions, which were frequent and spectacular events designed to reinforce state authority through the controlled infliction of death, or from the industrial warfare of the 20th century, where nations mobilized millions of men to slaughter each other with unprecedented efficiency? Perhaps Mesoamerican sacrifice seems more shocking because it claimed religious rather than secular justification. But the boundary between sacred and profane violence is less clear than we might like to think. This is not to make facile equivalences or claim that all violence is the same. The specific contexts, meanings, and implications of violence vary enormously across cultures and historical periods. But it is to suggest that the Toltec wrestling with the role of violence in civilization, the tension between Quetzalcoatl's supposed opposition to sacrifice and Tezcatlipoca's embrace of it engages with a fundamental and still unresolved human dilemma. Can we create complex, prosperous societies without systematic violence? Can we protect ourselves and our communities without institutions of organized killing? Can we maintain social order without the threat, at least, of coercive force? These are not questions the Toltecs answered successfully, but they are questions that remain pressing today. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the story of Tollan reminds us that civilizations are mortal. They rise, flourish, decline, and fall with regularity. This is not a counsel of despair, but an acknowledgement of reality. The works we create, the institutions we build, the knowledge we accumulate, none of it is guaranteed permanence. Tula's massive pyramids still stand, weathered by 1,000 years of rain and wind. The Atlantid warriors still gaze across the valley, but the civilization that built them is gone, its language mostly extinct, its literature lost, its music silent. What remains is fragment stones and pottery, murals and sculptures, bones and seeds, from which archaeologists painstakingly reconstruct a partial understanding, and myths, which are more complete than the archaeological record but less reliable, preserving different kinds of truth. This impermanence is not tragedy but condition. Nothing lasts forever. Nikan Mopahua. The Aztecs understood this, perhaps better than we do, with our faith in progress and our assumption that our own civilization is somehow exempt from history's pattern of rise and fall. But acknowledging impermanence does not require nihilism or despair. Quite the opposite can focus our attention on what matters. If our civilization will not last forever, if our works will eventually crumble to dust like Tula's temples, then what we do now becomes more important, not less. The question is not how to achieve permanence, which is impossible, but how to create something worthy during our brief moment of existence. The Toltecs created something worthy. Their art still moves us. Their myths still resonate. Their questions about power and wisdom, violence and culture, force and persuasion still challenge us. Quetzalcoatl, whether he was a real priest-king or a mythological construct, represents an aspiration that remains relevant. That we might be governed by wisdom rather than mere power, that knowledge and culture matter as much as, or more than, martial prowess, that there might be a higher purpose to political organization than simply the accumulation and exercise of force. That this aspiration was not realized in Tollan, that the philosopher-king was defeated, and the warrior ethos triumphed. That the civilization built on military conquest ultimately destroyed itself. This does not invalidate the aspiration. It makes it more poignant, perhaps more clearly difficult, but no less important. Every generation must ask itself the question that the Toltec story poses. What kind of civilization do we want to create? What values will guide us? Will we choose Quetzalcoatl's wisdom or Tezcatlipoca's power? And can we find some way to honor both, to balance the creative and destructive aspects of human nature, to build something that might not last forever, but that is worth building nonetheless? The ruins of Tula offer no easy answers to these questions, but in their silent testimony to both achievement and failure in the persistence of memory long after political power has vanished, in the transformation of history into myth and myth into meaning, they remind us that the struggle to create civilization imperfect, compromised, mortal, but nevertheless worthwhile's the permanent human condition. The philosopher-kings of Tollan may be long dead, their city reduced to stones in a field, but their questions remain alive. And that, perhaps, is its own kind of immortality. As the sun sets over the Valley of Mexico, the last light catches the stone faces of the Atlantid warriors. For a moment, they seem almost alive, these eternal guardians of a vanished world. Then darkness falls, and they disappear into shadow, waiting patiently for the dawn. The feathered serpent and the smoken mirror, the philosopher and the warrior. Wisdom and power, the struggle continues, as it always has, as perhaps it always will. The Toltecs gave us their answer. We must find our own.